You've heard of Mordor, you've heard of Angband, but before them all was Utumno, Morgoth's first and largest fortress in Middle-earth. It was arguably the most evil place that ever existed, and its presence was responsible for the corruption in the northern lands that existed even into the Fourth Age. But despite its importance in Tolkien's early legendarium, there is one little problem. We don't even really know where Utumno was. So in this video, let's try and locate Utumno, and let's see what might have happened to it. As I said, Utumno was Morgoth's first fortress. Like Angband, it was largely delved underground, and was home to all sorts of horrible evil creatures that were corrupted in the early days of Arda, or even before. When the elves first awoke, and the Valar became aware that Morgoth was harassing them, the Valar launched an all-out attack on Morgoth's holdings in Middle-earth. This was the Battle of the Powers, and the destruction from that war reshaped Middle-earth. Morgoth was defeated, captured, and taken back to Valinor in chains. But the victory was not complete either. Nonetheless, the Valar did not discover all the mighty vaults and caverns hidden with deceit far under the fortresses of Angband and Utumno. Many evil things still lingered there, and others were dispersed and fled into the dark and roamed in the waste places of the world, awaiting a more evil hour, and Sauron they did not find. Of course, Morgoth does not go back to Utumno, and instead decides that Angband will now be his primary fortress. He rebuilds it and creates the volcanic towers of Fangorodrim, and from this nigh impenetrable fortress he would wage his war upon Beleriand. In the end, Angband is utterly destroyed in the War of Wrath, and whatever is left sinks into the ocean along with most of Beleriand and much of the northern lands. But what about Utumno? It basically just disappears from history, but the quote from the Silmarillion states that it, like Angband, was not completely destroyed, and that remnants of it must have existed through the First Age at least. So the question is, what ended up happening to Utumno? And the answer? We don't really know, because we're not exactly sure where Utumno even was. There's only two things we do know about Utumno's location. It was somewhere in the north of Middle-earth, and it appears to have been either beneath or just behind the Ered Engren, the Iron Mountains. Utumno appears in exactly two of Tolkien's maps, both of them very early maps with very little detail, and both maps have Utumno appearing in completely different locations. This is the first map. Yes, the very first map Tolkien ever drew, which was redrawn by Christopher Tolkien. As you can see, it's not very helpful, it's barely even recognisable as Arda. At the top of the map, you can see Utumno written as Utumna, deep in the northern reaches of Middle-earth. The second map, known as Ambercantar IV, is much better, but it was still drawn in the early stage of Tolkien's Legendarium. As you can see, it's a map of Arda during the time of the Two Lamps, and Middle-earth is vaguely recognisable, but still very different from its final form. In this map, Utumno has been moved to the west, and is located just behind the Iron Mountains, and just to the east of Beleriand. So, as you can see, there's not a lot of information in regards to Utumno, two early maps, and a couple of vague descriptions. That being said, you might have seen this map by Karen Wynne Fonstad from the Atlas of Middle-earth. In this map, Fonstad has placed the ruins of Utumno roughly where Tolkien placed Utumno in Ambercantar IV, just to the east of Beleriand. Now, Fonstad did some amazing maps, but there are some issues, and they're not entirely accurate. This isn't really her fault. The Atlas was published in 1981 when lots of Tolkien's work still remained unpublished. For example, we now know that her map of the First Age has some major inaccuracies, namely the Sea of Rhûn and the Grey Mountains did exist in the First Age. In Fonstad's map, the Sea of Rhûn does not exist, and the Grey Mountains are part of the Iron Mountains. So what's this got to do with Utumno? Because her placement of Utumno seems fairly consistent with Tolkien's placement in Ambercantar IV, right? Well, it's the same concept as before. Fonstad based her map off of Tolkien's earlier maps, and without all of the information that we have available today. So we know a redrawn map would look a fair bit different. One major notable detail is that when Tolkien drew Ambercantar IV, Angband did not yet exist, and in Ambercantar V, we see that Angband is now placed only a little to the west of where Utumno was in map 4, and that Utumno itself is entirely missing. This means that Fonstad's placement of Utumno isn't necessarily accurate because she's drawing information from two different phases of the development of the Legendarium. If Tolkien had made an extra map depicting both Utumno and Angband, some people believe that Tolkien would have moved Utumno east towards its original location due to Angband's role as the western fortress. I've seen a few claims that Tolkien did move Utumno, but just never on a map. One piece of evidence I've seen cited is this. And passing northward, about the Sea of Helcar, they turned towards the west. Before them, great clouds hung still black in the north above the ruins of war, and the stars in that region were hidden. Then, not a few grew afraid, and repented, and turned back, and are forgotten. The claim is that if the elves could see the smoke from the ruin of the north, then Utumno must have been in the east, given the Sea of Helcar's location. However, I don't find this convincing, as the text specifically states that the elves were facing westwards, towards where Tolkien placed Utumno in Ambercantar 4. Regardless, one could still argue that Tolkien might have returned Utumno to Central or Eastern Middle-earth after coming up with the concept of Angband. Okay, so where was Utumno? Well, that's up for debate. There's two main possibilities which lead to two main outcomes. The first is that Utumno is in the west, where Fonstad places it based off of Ambercantar 4. The second is that Utumno is somewhere to the east or northeast, far from where Angband would eventually be located. So, onto the big question. What ultimately happened to Utumno? The answer to this depends on where you believe Utumno was, and because this channel is all about diving into these questions, we'll look at the answers for both. If Utumno was where Fonstad places it, we get some very interesting theories as to what may have happened to the ruins of Morgoth's old fortress. You might notice that Fonstad's location for the ruins of Utumno is directly north of what is Eriador in the Third Age. Specifically, it's directly north to northeast of Lake Evendim. You'll note that the mountains there have been broken, so it's hard to tell exactly where Utumno matches up in relation to a Third Age map, but there is a rough area which has led to two main theories. The first theory, and for me, the slightly more outlandish theory, is that the ruins of Utumno are directly beneath Carn Dûm, the Witch King's capital in Angmar. Proponents for this theory believe that this is why Angmar is such a cold, evil place, and why Carn Dûm was built where it was. Interestingly enough, it seems even the developers of Battle for Middle-earth: Rise of the Witch King may have believed in this theory, as they state that the Witch King built Carn Dûm over the top of a ruined fortress from an earlier age. However, there is absolutely zero textual evidence for this, and any link between Carn Dûm and Utumno comes completely from Fonstad's map alone. The second theory, and for me, the slightly more believable theory, is that the ruins of Utumno are beneath the Ice Bay of Thorkel. This would explain why the Ice Bay is so cold, and it might even help explain why the Ice Bay actually exists. Perhaps this area was intentionally sunk after the War of Wrath to also get rid of any remnants of Utumno. It also matches up better to both Fonstad's map and Ambercantar 4, which place Utumno slightly to the east of the Blue Mountains, so right where the Ice Bay would be. However, once again, there's zero textual evidence for this. But what about our second location? What if Utumno was in north-central or northeastern Middle-earth? If we're using Fonstad's map of the Third Age, which is probably the most accurate map we have, the northern land of Forodwaith extends very far to the north, and was mostly unaffected by the War of Wrath and later cataclysms. This could mean that the remnants of Utumno exist somewhere in this vast frozen wasteland. So technically, one might be able to find the ruins of Utumno in the Third Age. That doesn't mean it would be easy though. In fact, I would say that it would be nigh impossible. Forodwaith is freezing cold and unforgiving, where only hardy people such as the Lossoth survive, and creatures of darkness such as orcs and dragons. Given that Utumno was mostly underground, it would probably be under miles of snow. Finding it would be very difficult, and even if you did find it, there's no real reason to go inside unless you have a death wish. Even if Morgoth's servants are long gone, and that's an if, it would probably still be a place of horror and nightmares, and there probably wouldn't be anything of actual physical value to an adventurer. So what was the ultimate fate of Utumno? Perhaps it was buried beneath the waves at the end of the First Age, inaccessible to anyone without a submarine, which is everyone. Perhaps it lay beneath the evil land of Angmar, and deep beneath the ruins of the Witch King's fortresses, one could find tunnels down to the most evil place of them all. Or perhaps it remained in the frozen lands far to the north, buried far beneath snow where no man or elf had ever tread out of free will. As with all things in this playlist, it's a mystery. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want to learn more about Utumno, then bad luck, there isn't any. This is what you sign up for when you become a fan of Tolkien's work. Interesting concepts with only 3 lines written about them over a 50-year period. Cheers, farewell, and remember, don't be a character from a shitty horror movie. If you come across any ancient ruins that irradiate evil, don't go inside.